July 1904. Berkeley County, South Carolina. A man named Kit Booker was lynched for arguing with a white man who had molested Booker's sister. August 1906. Greenwood County, South Carolina. A man named Bob Davis was lynched. He was falsely accused of raping a white woman. October 1906. Charleston, South Carolina. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born, also known as Bumpy Johnson. Chapter 1. The Family. Bumpy grew up as one of 7 children in a poor family. His father was a fisherman. His mother was a domestic worker. When Bumpy was 10 years old, his brother Willie was accused of killing a white man. Bumpy's parents sent Willie to New York because they feared a racist lynch mob would kill him. Meanwhile, Bumpy was becoming increasingly angry and rebellious. 3 years later, his parents sent him to live with his sister in Harlem. Chapter 2. The Father of Harlem. In 1890, Harlem was the next big thing in Manhattan real estate. By 1904, the boom had turned to bust. Hundreds of new homes stood unsold. Thousands of new apartments in Harlem remained vacant. Philip A. Payton Jr. was an African-American real estate entrepreneur. Payton told struggling white landlords that he could fill their empty houses with African Americans. The suggestion was accepted because black people were willing to pay higher rents. But some white property owners tried to force black residents out of Harlem. By 1904, Payton formed the Afro-American Realty Company. The purpose of the company was to buy and lease houses for African-American occupancy. White people panicked and began fleeing Harlem, i.e., white flight. House after house and block after block was left deserted. By 1913, Harlem was home to 50,000 African Americans. Soon, African Americans started opening up businesses in Harlem. White shop owners hired Irish gangs from Hell's Kitchen and the Tenderloin to frighten off black shop owners. Black Harlem shop owners weren't going to give up without a fight. They hired local men like William Bub Hewlett to protect their businesses. Bub Hewlett and his gang ran the Irish thugs out of Harlem. Philip A. Payton Jr. died in 1917. He would later become known as the Father of Harlem. By 1919, Harlem was emerging as the capital of Black America. 1919 was also the year 13-year-old Bumpy Johnson moved to Harlem. Chapter 3. The Hustle. 1920s. 13-year-old Bumpy was sent to live with his sister and her family in Harlem. They lived on West 150th Street. Bumpy would skip school to hang out with friends. Friends like Jameson Junie Bird and Jacob Nat Pettigrew. Amid the poverty, Bumpy and his crews found ways to make money. From selling newspapers to shooting craps and hustling pool. Bumpy would also sweep sidewalks in front of individual stores. Bumpy stashed his money and planned to send it back home to his parents. Chapter 4. Bub Hewlett. Bub Hewlett was born in Virginia in 1888. He was the leader of the Bub Hewlett gang. The gang ran protection rackets on local black businesses in Harlem. "16-year-old Bumpy decided he wanted a piece of the pie. He and his crew offered protection to some of the newer shops in Harlem. One day, Bub went to offer his protection services to a new grocery store on 7th Avenue. But much to Bub's surprise, the owner was already paying Bumpy for protection. Bub confronted Bumpy and they exchanged words back and forth. Bumpy refused to give up his territory to Bub. Bub soon realized Bumpy wasn't a pushover. Bub agreed to let young Bumpy have the spot in exchange for a share of the protection money. This was the beginning of their long friendship. Chapter 5. Playing the Numbers. By the 1840s, states began to ban lotteries and to criminalize gambling. The same period saw the emergence of a gambling culture and of illegal gambling. Policy gambling, also known as the numbers game, was an illegal lottery. The numbers game was introduced to Harlem in the 1920s. It operated in Harlem's poor black neighborhoods. During this period, it was America's largest black-owned business. The game consisted of a player picking any three-digit number from 0 to 999. Bets were generally a nickel or a dime, but any amount was acceptable. The winning number was taken each day from a source that the promoters of the game cannot control, e.g., stock exchange, bank financial balances, or racetrack results. Those who ran, owned, and controlled the numbers game were called policy bankers. Casper Holstein was a policy banker. Casper Holstein was born in St. Croix, Danish West Indies, in 1876. In 1894, he moved to New York and spent his teenage years in Brooklyn. He enlisted in the United States Navy shortly before the Spanish-American War. After the war, he came home to work as a Fifth Avenue store porter. The New York Clearing House was a financial institution that facilitated the daily exchanges and settlements of money between the city's banks. Each day, the New York Clearing House totals were printed in the afternoon newspapers. Holstein studied these daily figures. Six months later, Holstein invented the clearinghouse numbers game. It was a gambling game based on the daily closing results of the New York Clearing House. This illegal lottery was played throughout the 1920s. By the mid-1920s, Holstein earned $2 million from his lotteries. Holstein also owned several properties, a nightclub, and acres of farmland in Virginia. Holstein was known as Harlem's only African-American philanthropist. He helped fund Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. Holstein was famed for his patronage of the arts, charities, and other good causes. The numbers game turned over tens of millions of dollars every year. By the mid-1920s, other black policy bankers had established prosperous numbers operations, such as Big Joe Isson, Willie Brunder, Stephanie St. Clair, and Alex Pompez. Alex Pompez was a black Cuban American. He was born in 1890, Key West, Florida. In 1910, Pompez moved to New York, where he found work as a cigar maker. A year later, he opened up his own cigar shop in Harlem. Out of that cigar shop, Pompez soon began running numbers. Pompez was also a manager and owner of a Negro League baseball team. He later served as the vice president of the Negro National League. He was one of the wealthiest men in Harlem. Chapter 6. The Gutter. Policy bankers were very serious about their personal security. They hired men like Bub for protection. It was Bub who suggested Bumpy and his crew offer protection to policy bankers in Harlem. In 1924, Bumpy was escorting Alex Pompez home after a night out in Spanish Harlem. All of a sudden, a man came out from an alley waving a gun. He pointed the gun at Pompez and demanded he hand over his wallet. Bumpy flicked open his switchblade and slashed the thief's face. Bumpy then shoved Pompez into a car and told him to stay put. Bumpy then proceeded to slash the thief's throat and body. The thief dropped the gun and fell to the floor. A police officer on patrol was passing by and he heard the commotion. But by then, Bumpy had kicked the knife into the gutter. The officer began to question Bumpy, but Bumpy was uncooperative. The officer then attempted to question Pompez, but Bumpy blocked his path. Bumpy told the driver to get Pompez out of there. The officer tried to push Bumpy out the way, and then Bumpy punched him. 3 more officers arrived on the scene, and Bumpy was subdued and arrested. He was charged with assaulting an officer and resisting arrest. He was also charged with attempted murder because the thief survived the knife attack. Pompez hired a prominent lawyer to represent Bumpy. Bumpy was only convicted for disorderly conduct and sentenced to 1 year probation. Baron Wilkins was a leading nightclub owner in Harlem. He owned a club called the Exclusive Club. In 1908, he financed his friend Jack Johnson's fight for the heavyweight title. He was also a close friend of Bub's. In 1924, a man known as Yellow Charleston shot and killed a man over a dice game in a basement in Harlem. Charleston then approached Wilkins, who was standing outside his club. He demanded $100 to make a getaway. But then Wilkins said he had no money. Charleston shot him and fled the scene. Wilkins died en route to the hospital. When Bub and Bumpy heard what happened, they began searching the streets for Charleston. Fearing that he would be killed, Charleston handed himself to the police. Yellow Charleston was convicted of first-degree murder in both deaths. He went to the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in 1925. 70,000 people lined up in Harlem for Baron Wilkins' funeral procession. A few weeks later, Bumpy started working for Stephanie St. Clair. She hired him to protect one of her many Harlem number spots. A year later, Bumpy was sent to prison for 10 years on a burglary charge. 2 years later, Bumpy was granted parole. In 1927, he was sentenced to another 2 years in prison on an assault charge. 5 months after his release, he was sentenced to 2 years on a grand larceny charge. Chapter 7, Queenie. Stephanie St. Clair was born in Guadeloupe in 1886. In 1910, she arrived in Harlem. She was also known as Madam Queen or occasionally Queenie. In 1922, she started her own numbers racket. Within a few years, she was clearing $250,000 a year. Queenie was the only female policy banker in Harlem. In 1924, she hired Bumpy to be a personal bodyguard. By the 1930s, she employed over 70 people. In 1920, the United States banned the sale and import of alcoholic beverages. This was known as the Prohibition era in the United States. The prohibition of liquor created the business of bootlegging. Bootlegging was the illegal production or distribution of liquor. By the 1930s, bootlegging had become one of the largest industries in America. Gangsters like Meyer Lansky, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano were making millions from bootlegging. Dutch Schultz was another gangster who was in the business of bootlegging. He was a violent Jewish mobster and had cops and politicians on his payroll. In the late 1920s, he decided he wanted in on the numbers racket. Dutch Schultz was born in 1902 and raised in the Bronx. During the early 1920s, Schultz drove alcohol trucks for Arnold Rothstein. Schultz was also known as the Dutchman, or Dutch. By the late 1920s, Schultz started his own bootlegging business. Schultz's illegal operations spread from the Bronx into Upper Manhattan. Schultz was known for his short temper and would kill for no reason. In 1928, Casper Holstein was kidnapped as he got out of his limousine. The kidnappers demanded a $50,000 ransom. A few days later, Holstein was released. Rumors were one of the kidnappers was Vincent Mad Dog Call, who at the time was working for Schultz. In 1931, Holstein retired from the numbers business. Schultz became aware of the millions being made by policy bankers in Harlem. In 1930, Queenie was sentenced to a year in prison for racketeering. By 1931, Schultz had taken control of the numbers racket in Harlem. Policy bankers like Willie Brunder, Big Joe Issen, Alex Pompez, and others surrendered their operations to Schultz. They were now in a partnership with Schultz and were reduced to earning a weekly salary of $200. Schultz also hired Bub to be his chief enforcer in Harlem. Bub approached Queenie and told her to surrender her business to Schultz. Queenie refused. Over the next few days, Queenie's number spots were targets of drive-by shootings. Her employees were beaten and threatened. Queenie still refused to surrender her operation to Schultz. In 1932, Schultz's men offered money to a friend of Queenie. They asked the friend to lure Queenie into an apartment so that they could kill her. The friend ran back to Queenie and told her of Schultz's plot. In October 1932, Bumpy was released from prison. Bub asked Bumpy to come to work for him. Bumpy said he would think about it. Instead, Bumpy started working for Queenie again. In 1933, Schultz went into hiding to avoid tax evasion charges. Over the next 2 years, Queenie held on to her operation with the help of Bumpy. In December 1932, Bub and his crew were paid to kidnap and beat up a man. The victim decided to press charges. In April 1933, Bub was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. With Bub gone, Schultz hired another black man to be his enforcer in Harlem. He was from Chicago, and his name was Ulysses Rollins. In 1934, Bumpy visited Luciano and asked him to talk some sense into Schultz. Luciano said he could do nothing because he and Schultz were partners in other businesses. Bumpy had started an affair with the editor of Vanity Fair, Helen Lawrenson. In 1935, Bumpy had taken Helen to dinner at a bar in Harlem. When suddenly, Bumpy spotted his new nemesis, Rollins. Bumpy pulled out a knife and stabbed Rollins in his face and body. Rollins miraculously survived the attack and wanted revenge. He left the hospital the same night and found Bumpy sitting in a restaurant. He pulled out a gun and shot at Bumpy's head. The bullet went through Bumpy's hat and hit an innocent bystander, killing her. Rollins was arrested by an off-duty cop who happened to be at the restaurant. He was convicted and sent to prison. Thomas Dewey was a special prosecutor. Dewey was investigating Schultz. Schultz demanded that Luciano and the commission agree to whack Dewey, but the commission refused to sanction a hit on Dewey. Schultz disobeyed the commission's orders and started making plans to have Dewey assassinated. On October 23, 1935, Schultz was shot in the bathroom of a restaurant. He staggered out and sat at a table and was taken to a hospital in an ambulance. The hit was carried out by Murder Inc. members. While Schultz lay on his deathbed, Queenie sent him a telegram. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Schultz lasted for about 22 hours in the hospital before dying. Lucky Luciano took control of Schultz's number operations. A week later, Luciano requested a meeting with Bumpy. Luciano agreed to let the bankers who had fought for their independence to remain independent. The mob would also do nothing in Harlem without giving Bumpy his cut. Bumpy now acted as the frontman in Harlem for the Genovese family. Bumpy opened up his own numbers bank. In 1936, Queenie retired from numbers and got married to Sufi Abdul Hamid. But Hamid was cheating on Queenie with a woman named Fu Fatam. In 1938, Queenie shot her husband twice. He survived, and Queenie was arrested. In court, Queenie said Hamid had only married her for her money. She was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 10 years. Some weeks after the trial, Hamid married Fatam. Six months later, Hamid died in a plane crash while piloting his own plane. After serving her time, Queenie moved into a mansion on Long Island. She died in 1969.